This week on Security and Compliance Weekly, we're going to have a roundtable discussion, possibly an argument, on the topic of building a security program, building a compliance program. Are they the same thing? Are they different? We're going to find out. Once we make that conclusion, we'll figure out what they should look like, where they should fit within the organization, how do they compete for budgets, all this and more. For that part of the discussion. In our second segment, we'll discuss security and compliance news of the week. Some articles such as why CFOs must be involved in cybersecurity, which might relate to our topic of discussion today. Password reuse is a ticking time bomb. How the Online Privacy Act will create the need for a new federal enforcement agency, all this and more. So join us as we tear down silos and build bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. Today's organizations face an evolving set of security threats and continually changing compliance requirements. As your business grows, privacy concerns only multiply and add to a dynamic set of priorities. Today's organizations need to integrate risk, security, and privacy into a cohesive program. Online Business Systems team of seasoned security practitioners work closely with you to assess your security posture, policies, procedures, and technologies, providing tailored solutions that are specifically aligned to your business's risk profile and ultimately ensure the protection of your brand. To learn more about Online Business Systems, go to securityweekly.com/online.
Welcome, everyone, to episode number 6 of Security and Compliance Weekly. We're recording this on November 12th, 2019. I'm your host, Jeff Mann, coming you to remotely from cold and slightly rainy Maryland. With me today are my illustrious co-hosts, Scott Lyons, Josh Marpet, and Matt Alderman. Say hello, everyone, in no particular order.
Good to be here.
There we are in the Hollywood Squares format. Hey, before we get going on the discussion today, we do have a couple announcements. First and foremost, in case you haven't noticed it yet, the new Security Weekly website is officially live. Please go out and visit securityweekly.com to check out all the new sorting and filtering functionality, which Paul, I know, has been working months and months on getting it right. And if you have any issues or if you have any feedback, we would love to hear from you. You can send that feedback to the email alias of website@securityweekly.net. Also, if you can find on our website, we're currently running our annual listener feedback survey, which gives you a chance to give us feedback on the shows in general, not just our website. Go to securityweekly.com. You'll find a survey tab, and you click on that and select the 2009 listener survey. We'd love to hear from you, so please submit your responses soon. All right, gentlemen. Security program, compliance program. Had the idea for this topic because somebody had copied a tweet into our Slack channel about somebody complaining about how do you get a budget for your program when you haven't even done what I think they were saying was some of the fundamentals or building blocks of how you determine where you are in terms of, I would assume, maturity. And I think they were asking the question in the context of security program, but because we're trying to stir things up a little bit, I was wondering immediately, well, what about a compliance program? And are they the same or are they different? Any opening kickoff thoughts or suggestions?
So I'm going to throw something in the ring here, and that's that security and compliance are inextricably linked. You've got security, which is designed to protect every asset of the company, organization, agency, whatever. You've got compliance, which is designed to make sure that security, IT, system administration, and everybody in the company, organization, agency, whatever, are doing what they said they were going to do. So far, so good. So if that's the case, they should work together. And as such, why should they have separate systems? Why should they have separate organizational entities to a certain extent. They should be different departments, but there should be links between data, between auditable repositories, between the results from Splunk, or so on and so forth. And extending that, you should have the same sort of cooperation with IT. After all, 80% of security is good system administration. If you don't do your system administration, your system build, your change control, your configuration management, oh wait, doesn't that all sound like IT and compliance and security? It does, because it is.
So Josh, I'll make one adjustment to the definition for a second.
I was going to make several, but go ahead.
Yeah,
man.
okay. The challenge is compliance and security is not a one-to-one relationship. Compliance can actually be broader than just security. If you go out and look at a lot of the regulatory requirements outside of PCI DSS for a second, if you look at Gramm-Leach-Bliley, if you look at HIPAA, those compliance requirements are broader than just a security. Security is a subset of those. And so what I don't want people to think is that compliance, security, one-to-one. Compliance can actually be a little broader than security. They are linked and they need to be linked, but compliance programs can affect other entities in the organization outside of IT and security. It could affect the financial side. It can affect procurement. There's a lot of other pieces that compliance covers outside of just IT and security.
And under SOX, which is a compliance regime, you've got security needing to be involved in the auditability and security of the financial system. So there's your finance department where security is now involved because of compliance. Obviously they want to be involved because they want to protect it. But that goes back to the definition that I gave just a minute ago. So I agree with you, but I think that there are linkages that are far greater than you're talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's you guys are missing the major point here, right? It all depends on what the business is doing. Some businesses require more compliance than security, yes. Some businesses require more security than compliance, yes. It all has to be fit to what the business is doing. And a lot of people lose sight of that and they say, oh, we need security. We need to protect ourselves. Well, understand what your business is doing before you jump down that rabbit hole.
I agree with you 100% on that one. I mean, again, it goes back to a risk-based framework that starts by understanding your business, understanding your business objectives, understanding your risk posture associated to that, and then applying the appropriate controls, which and on and on and on. So you're right. Whether compliance is in or out of that discussion, it's usually compliance that forces that discussion for most organizations, unfortunately.
Yeah, it does. And if companies do follow compliance regimes, the compliance regimes are really set up to get companies to do the basics, the absolute basics of security. Firewalls, firewall logging, vulnerabilities, vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, whether it be light or intrusively heavy, right? The basics of security are really where the heart of compliance is rooted, right, with that connection. Right? If you do the basics, you're 80% ahead of the game.
So let's pause right here for a second after this sort of initial go round in this virtual round table. One thing that I think is very important when we're discussing things like anything really, but in this particular case, so I asked initially, what's the difference, or is there a difference between security and compliance programs? Josh, you did a pretty good job of sort of stating the differences, but I want to take a moment to sort of summarize and make sure we're in agreement, and especially for our listeners, make sure they're on the same page. What I'm hearing from the initial opening discussion is that whatever we call security within an organization, it's more the people in the trenches, the actual practitioners doing all the things associated with, I think the way you had described it was protecting assets in the organization. Whereas compliance, to try to simplify that from what you described, is what sounds like somewhat of an independent function in terms of monitoring or measuring to determine if you're doing enough or if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, if it's following a standard like PCI. So in that sense, are we in agreement that they are two distinct functions, or should be 2 distinct functions in any given organization?
For a specific purpose, yes. And what I mean by specific purpose, sorry, I should explain that. For separation of duties, they should be 2 separate functions. The performance and the verification of performance should always be separated. Otherwise, you have a problem with you're validating your own work. That's not really appropriate, So we separate them so that one person or one group or one whatever does the work, and then one group validates that the work was done and helps guide through the next phases of work, helps work on the various pieces. I'm not saying the compliance doesn't do work. Please don't misunderstand. What I'm saying is that the compliance department or group or whatever is there to not only validate that the work was done properly, they're there to protect that work, because they're the ones validating it. They're the ones putting their names and their reputations on the line. They're trusting that the security people that did the work in question are actually, when they say, yes, it was done right, they're putting their names on the line to protect the work that was done by the security people. So they're there to protect that work and that validation. But yeah, separation of duties mandates it must be 2 separate groups. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm not sure that happens in every organization. I think we all know examples out there where security owns compliance, and they kind of wear this dual hat, which doesn't really create that separation of duties in certain organizations. Now, I think there are industries and organizations that have been under compliance regimes for a while that have created that separation of duties and definitely have that separation like you described, Josh, but I'm not sure everybody's there yet.
Well, and that's probably where Scott's point about it depends on the organization, it depends on the business comes into play, and I think not maybe equal parts. Not sure how the ratio fits, but whether it's the organization itself knowing what business they're in versus because of the particular type of organization they're in, they have a particular compliance or regulatory standard that they have to meet, which dictates that they do it differently than other organizations. Am I reflecting your feelings accurately there, Scott?
Yeah, you are, but realistically, when you look at it in an abstract sense, you're looking at 2 things, right? You're looking at risk tolerance and you're looking at risk defenses, okay? So risk tolerance would be compliance, risk defenses would be security. Where's the abstract marker to say which way the business leans that dictates which way you need to go? Are you more risk tolerant, right? Being that you can go through all the compliance regimes, or are you more risk defensive, as in you carry PII, or you fall under GDPR, which means you need to put in strict controls, right? When you're looking at compliance sets, all compliances across the board are driven by 3 concepts: policies, procedures, and control implementation. When you can understand the amount of risk that you have in your org, whether it's defined by policy, procedure, or control implementation, then you can define what that ratio looks like of risk tolerance versus risk division. Defense. Yes. Sorry. Thank you. Risk tolerance versus risk defense. Make sense?
Somewhat, but you lost me a little bit on the policy, procedure, and then implementation control. I see them more as building blocks. You start with one and then you build on it. You sort of made it sound like they can be independently used as ammunition or enforcement techniques to make sure they do something.
They totally can. Okay, so if you are in a small business, right, you really care about policies, your procedures, you're doing them, but you don't really have them written down, right, versus a large or well-matured business, right, where you have your policies, your procedures, and your control implementation already outlined, right? So they can be used independently, right? But again, it all ties back to what the business does.
I don't equate large to mature. I don't think any of us would sign up for that.
We definitely know some very large organizations.
Look at me! I am not mature.
We know that about you, Jeff. Don't worry about it. Anyway, so
so I have a question for you guys, and no right or wrong answer, but PCI, for example, in a great part of the security industry gets knocked for being a checkbox compliance assessment, and there's all sorts of dumping on PCI because it doesn't mean anything, it has no substance or depth. Based on our discussion, is that perception based on the organizations that have security being in charge of compliance and they're checking their own boxes, or is it more organizations that have the separate compliance function that for whatever reason don't know what they're doing and they don't understand what security is within their own organization, so they're sort of checking the boxes naively or willy-nilly? What do you think is the difference?
I've got to take this. So this is a great question, and it's bigger than PCI. Compliance is denigrated all over the place as checkbox security. You're just checking a box. You're checking a box. You're checking a box. Doesn't mean anything. You're not doing anything. And the problem is that that's true. When you just check the box, you've hit what the standard writers, the standard authors have said this is the absolute minimum. But you're like, that's as far as I'm going to go. That's okay. We're done. So that's if you just check the box. Are there companies that do better? Oh my God, yes. There's lots of companies that do better than just checking the box. But the problem is that a company that's focus is just on profit, this quarter, right now, profit, short term, short vision profit, they're going to do whatever it takes to meet the absolute minimum requirements and get to the finish line for this quarter, to meet their earnings call, to get the PE ratio proper, and to get people buying their stock. Okay, and I think I got those terminologies correct. But and Matt, you'll check me on that, I hope. So the idea is that if all you're doing is checking boxes, then yeah, you're going to do the minimum, but you might not even do that. You might fake it. I mean, how many times have you seen a pen test be something that nobody around here would consider an actual pen test? How many times have you seen a pen test where they're barely scrubbing the Vulnscans logo off the front page? Right?
Well, the shorter question is, how many times have you seen a legitimate pen test report where there's supposed to be a pen test, which is close to zero.
Close to zero. But then that's the definition of pen test, and that's something that's another topic for another day. But the biggest problem is that checkbox compliance, I mean, hell, there's a term for it, for God's sakes. Checkbox compliance is rampant. But the idea, let's go back to PCI. The SAQ is designed to be a checkbox compliance, right? Let's be honest.
Right.
Okay?
Yep.
Because there's so many organizations that can't afford a QSA, don't need a QSA, we're just not going to bother with a QSA, whatever. Let's get them something so at least they have guidance on how to move forward. And the good organizations use it as guidance. And the bad ones, well, at least we've got something to hold over their heads.
And that's a good point. Where in the PCI world, organizations only have to do the self-assessment questionnaire, they're sort of forcing those organizations to be the security compliance function all rolled into one, which I think probably often they don't. The companies that qualify for SAQs probably don't have a formal compliance program in place. Not always. But I would think that the majority of them, it might be a simple majority, but the majority of them, they're the former category of security is in charge of compliance rather than having that separate arm. So but what I'm hearing you say is compliance kind of, if you have a bias, compliance really should be a separate, independent reporting organization, for this thing to work best within an organization.
Right.
You'll see
wait,
that.
There's more. Sorry, Matt, I gotta step on you for 1 second. There's more. So we're talking about how it's important to keep compliance and security separate. Okay, I'll just 1 more second. But if you think about it, this is also how they're supposed to work together. So just as we say in our tagline, breaking down barriers, bridging the gap, taking down silos, this is where it lives. This is where compliance and security and IT and system administration and the business itself, as Scott brought up, all need to work together, but they should be separate because they have different driving forces, different factors that drive them. But they should have the avenues to work together. And that's your configuration management. That's your change control. That's your auditable repositories. That's your data that comes in from your monitoring systems. They should all be able to work together for use of efficiency, but they all should be separate for use of separation of duties. And now I'll shut up and turn it over to Matt.
No, I mean, you did a great job describing it in the way that you laid it out. I think the other challenge we have here is there has always been this divide so in small organizations, you have kind of this combination of security and compliance in a role, right? That's why we see a lot of in the self-assessment questionnaire, PCI folks, it is one function. It's basically the IT security / compliance guy or gal. It's one person, right? Just because they're not that big. When you move into the more mature organizations, and the financials obviously are one of the more mature because they've been under Graham Leach Bliley since '99, have pretty mature programs. I mean, all the large banks have really robust risk, compliance, security teams, right?
But just as a side note, the large, mature organizations that are doing security right are largely there because early on they had regulatory compliance standards to meet. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean,
nobody's come by this. What's the word out? I can't get big words out right now. I've got jet lag. But nobody's doing it out of benevolence, like, oh, we should do the right thing as a company. All the large mature companies have done it because somebody on the outside has said you've got to do this, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, if you look at what happened, look, I have a lot of experience with some of the big banks in the early days of compliance, right? I remember the days when they were, outsourcing functions and saying, look, we're not going to deal with it. And the regulators came in and said, oh, you can outsource the function, but you don't get to outsource the risk. You still own it. You're going to manage your third parties. You're going to manage the risk. You're going to make sure that those guys are compliant to your policies and procedures, right? That was like 2003, 4 years after GLBA was announced. So yes, the regulators actually put pressure on the large banks at the time to not only deal with the internal risk components, but also external, which is why they've created much more mature programs. But you're right, Jeff. I mean, without that regulation, would they have done it natively on their own? Some they would have. Look, because they've got to deal with fraud and fraud loss and certain aspects. But would they go as deep as they are today? Maybe not without some of those requirements.
So we've only got a few minutes left. I wanted to shift gears real quickly, and we probably won't be able to do justice to this, but we've determined that these are separate functions or should be ideally separate functions in an organization. How then do they compete or work together in terms of budgets? How much should an organization spend on security versus compliance? The doing function versus the how well are we doing function? Any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, that depends significantly on how heavily regulated that company and that industry, that vertical is. Healthcare obviously has HIPAA costs, whereas a record-keeping group that doesn't do any healthcare doesn't have those same costs. But assume a highly regulated industry, law, healthcare, any of the above, okay, banking, whatever, financial, your costs are going to be not as high as security to do your compliance. On your people, they're going to be partially borne by your security and IT groups for your monitoring, auditable repositories, and various other applications and systems. So if you have, let's say, 10 security people, you're going to have 3 to 5 compliance people. You're going to have a lot of the costs of the applications for compliance borne by the IT and system administration and security groups. And you're going to have just a few applications, GRC tools, things like that the compliance people need to have. Weirdly enough, depending on how far-flung your locations are, you'll have more travel for your compliance than you will for your security. So there's trade-offs.
Right, but that also depends on the flip side of the cost coin, Josh. The flip side of the cost coin is how much work have you already done, right? Has it been documented, right? If you have an auditor come in and say, well, show me your firewall logs. We didn't know we needed to do that, but here they are. We're doing that regardless. Show me your last pen test. Here you go, thunk, right? Show me your last results for this control. Again, stuff may already have been done, but it's not documented, which means the cost has already been paid for, right? So instead of sitting back and saying, well, you need X amount of people over Y amount of time to do Z amount of things, you may have already done it in your organization, you know?
Hey, and one other question for you guys, and I'll sort of, necessarily need to make it sort of a short answer type of thing. And it's a two-part question. First part of the question is IT, people that are actually doing the day-to-day, keeping the network, keeping the business going, operations. Are they a separate group from security also within an ideal world? Yes, no?
Yes.
Round the horn?
Yes.
No, they're a separate group from security, but they're intricately, intimately involved with security. They
receive drivers and provide input to security.
Okay, no, so here's the final round of short answer responses. We've talked about purpose, knowing the business, policies, procedures, implementations. So of these three groups, or maybe even somebody else, who's responsible for determining the purpose? What's the business? What are we doing? Is it IT? Is it security? Is it compliance? Or is it somebody to be named later? Just short answer response.
The board.
The board.
Board?
Yeah,
board?
The board.
Okay.
The board is vision and guidance.
Okay, policy. Who's responsible for creating policy?
Executives.
C-level executives. They take that long-term vision and strategy from the board and then kernelize it down into short-term vision and strategy plus policy to drive the business to get it to where it needs to be.
Which probably is owned by the compliance team. No, I mean, it comes down from the board to the executives. It depends on how you're structured. But typically the compliance office is going to make sure that policies are documented for the organization.
Well, that was going to be my pushback, is that policy is typically written by the group that is also owning compliance. So what's next? Policies.
By the executives and the board.
Procedures.
Procedures will be a
documented process.
It could be split, actually. Because this is where the operational guys come into play a bit. So this could also, some of those are going to be done by compliance, some are going to be done by security, and some are probably going to be done by IT. It becomes more of a distributed function, I think.
Is it fair to say it should be more of a collaboration?
I will disagree with Matt in that they are consulted. The people doing the work, the technologists, the staff, are consulted as to how do you do X, Y, or Z, but the people writing the procedures and ratifying the procedures will be at the level of management, line management.
Okay.
Yeah, because ultimately it's the line management who is responsible for making sure that things get done according to the policies, right? And so now you've got the procedures, right? And the CISSP, yes, I know everybody drink. In the CISSP, it's policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines, right? And that's how you generate a security program. But here, what we're talking about is how do you take the policies and then kernelize them down for the staff, right?
Right. So
and
when we say
that is procedures.
But when we say line management, line management to me is somebody in the security group line management, somebody in the IT group line management, somebody potentially in the compliance group line management, right? It is a distributed function. At the procedure level and to the control implementation and the control operations as well, because they're going to get distributed. IT is going to own some of those procedures and controls. Security is going to own some of those procedures and controls. Compliance might have some more that are to them when you deal with things like third party, for example, right? So
which is answering the fourth question, is in terms of the implementation of the controls according to the procedures. It's whoever's responsible for whatever the control is,
the individual group, staff, and their specific direct manager at that level. So that's the technologists, that's the compliance grunts, that's the IT system administrators, that's the actual people in the trenches.
Great. All right. Well, we've had a good discussion. Hopefully it's been a little bit educational, or at least illuminating to the degree that you know where some of us are coming from, perhaps. We're going to take a quick break, come back, and talk news of the week in the security and compliance world.